The sun is a hammer, and the desert is its anvil. Beneath it, a lone figure shuffles through the shimmering heat devils that dance on the hardpan. She is a woman, made anonymous by the vast, brutal emptiness around her. A wide-brimmed hat, its straw frayed and sun-bleached, casts a deep shadow over her face. A wooden yoke sits heavy on her shoulders, creaking with each pained step, its twin buckets sloshing precious, life-giving water. Her belly is a great, proud swell beneath her worn calico dress, a testament to a life that will soon enter a world that seems intent on ending it. Every day, she makes this journey, a pilgrimage of survival from a forgotten hovel somewhere in the east to the sun-blasted ramparts of Fort Defiance. The soldiers watch her come. She is their ghost, their sundial, a daily miracle of endurance they have ceased to question and simply accept, like the sunrise and the choking dust. Today, however, the miracle is fraying at the edges. Captain Elias Thorne watches her through his spyglass from the shade of the watchtower platform. The brass is hot against his eye. He has seen this woman for 58 days. He has counted. At first, she was a curiosity, a wager in the barracks. Then, a fixture. Now, a worry that gnaws at the edges of his command. Through the lens, he can see the fine tremor in her arms, the way her knees buckle almost imperceptibly with every other step. She stops, setting the buckets down with a gasp he cannot hear, but can feel in his own chest. She presses a hand to the small of her back, her head bowed against the blinding glare. He sees the dark patch of sweat that has soaked through the fabric of her dress, the dust clinging to her exhausted form. The men on the wall below him have fallen silent. Even the most cynical among them, Corporal Riggs, has stopped his ceaseless grumbling. The woman's daily trek has become a sacred, terrible theater. For weeks, she was just the water woman, a nameless, faceless purveyor of the one thing more valuable than gold in this godforsaken territory. But today, as she stumbles and sways under the weight of her burden and her child, Captain Elias Thorne knows he can no longer just watch. Her story and his duty were about to change. That was a close call. Before we see how our heroine navigates this, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. She pushes herself upright, her movements slow, deliberate, each one a victory against the crushing gravity of the day. She lifts the yoke, the strain of it a visible shock that ripples through her body. Elias lowers the spyglass, the metal leaving a faint red ring around his eye. He is a man accustomed to hard things, to death and discipline and the slow grinding down of men by this land. But the sight of her, a vessel of new life willingly marching into the furnace of the desert day after day, was a different kind of hardship. It was a defiance he didn't understand, a resilience that bordered on madness. He could not order the sun to relent or the desert to bloom, but he could no longer stand by and merely witness her slow, agonizing dissolution. Her name was a void, her past a mystery, but her future was becoming his responsibility. And with that silent, unbidden acknowledgement, the carefully constructed walls of his military detachment began to crumble into dust. The desert had a way of stripping a man down to his essential parts. For Captain Elias Thorne, those parts were duty, discipline, and a quiet, gnawing loneliness he never acknowledged. Fort Defiance was less a fortress and more a stubborn declaration of existence. A handful of adobe buildings and a palisade wall dropped into the middle of nowhere. It was a place where time was measured in supply wagons and the changing angles of shadows on the parade ground. His days were a metronome of routine, drill, inspection, patrol orders, reports. The men under his command were a collection of veterans, greenhorns, and malcontents, all bound by the uniform and the shared enemy of heat, boredom, and the ever-present, unseen threat of Apache raiders who were masters of this terrain. Into this crucible of masculine isolation, she had walked. The first time they saw her, she was a mere speck on the eastern horizon, slowly resolving into a woman carrying buckets. Sergeant Miller had called up to the tower, "Captain, You're going to want to see this. Elias had trained his spyglass on her, his mind cycling through possibilities. A settler's wife whose wagon had broken down, a survivor of an attack, perhaps someone who had lost their senses to the sun. She approached the gate without hailing them, moving with a weary but unshakable purpose. She stopped a respectful distance away, lowered the buckets, and waited. A lieutenant, young and fresh from the east, had gone out to meet her. The exchange was brief. She had water, fresh and clean, from a hidden spring she knew of. The fort's own well was brackish and rationed. She wanted a trade, not for money, but for food. Flour, salt pork, beans. The lieutenant reported back, baffled. She won't say much, sir. Just that she'll bring water every day if we trade for victuals. She's with child, sir. Very much so. Elias had approved the trade. Clean water was a tactical advantage, a bulwark against sickness. It was a sound military decision, but it felt like something else entirely. The woman became a part of their landscape. Every morning, shortly after the sun had cleared the distant mesas, she would appear. She never spoke to the soldiers who measured out her rations. She would simply nod, hoist her now empty buckets, and begin the long walk back to a life they could only imagine. The barracks buzzed with speculation. Some said she was the sole survivor of a massacre, her mind broken by the trauma. Others spun crueler tales, suggesting she was a camp follower left behind by a prospecting party, or that her husband had simply ridden off, abandoning her to her fate. Corporal Riggs, a man whose cynicism was as sharp as his bayonet, was the most vocal. "Mark my words," he'd said one evening, loud enough for all to hear, "she's a half-breed squaw hiding something. Or a lunatic. No sane woman does that." Elias had been cleaning his Colt Peacemaker nearby. He didn't look up, but the sudden, deliberate click of the hammer being cocked cut through the mess hall chatter. "Corporal," he said, his voice low and cold as a winter creek, "the woman provides a service to this fort. Her circumstances are not your concern. Her character is not your business. You will afford her the same respect you would any other civilian contractor. Is that understood?" Riggs, his face flushing, had mumbled, "Yes, sir." The speculation didn't stop, but became quieter, whispered in corners where the captain wasn't likely to overhear. The fort itself was a microcosm of their isolation. The adobe walls baked in the sun, radiating heat long after sunset. The wind was a constant, mournful presence, carrying dust that got into everything, their food, their water, their lungs. It was a life of grit and patience. Elias often found himself on the watchtower long after his duties required it, his gaze fixed on the eastern horizon. He'd watch until her small figure was swallowed by the haze, a strange sense of unease settling over him. He was responsible for the lives of over 100 men, for a piece of territory the government deemed strategically important. Yet, the fate of one silent, pregnant woman occupied an increasingly large portion of his thoughts. He told himself it was a commander's concern for a vital asset. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the ghosts of past battles and lost comrades walked the corridors of his mind, he knew it was something more. She was a symbol of a life clinging to the edge of a razor, and he, a man who had brought so much death into the world, felt an inexplicable pull to shield that flame from the wind. The sky, which had been a merciless, pale blue all morning, began to curdle in the west. The air grew heavy, still, and an ominous yellow light bled across the horizon. Elias saw it from his office window and felt a familiar prickle of alarm. Dust storm. They came on fast in this country, violent and blinding, capable of scouring the land and choking the life out of anything caught in the open. The woman had left the fort not 20 minutes earlier, her daily rations secured in a sack slung over her shoulder. "Sergeant!" Elias's voice boomed across the parade ground. Sergeant Miller appeared at his door, his weathered face already turned towards the changing sky. "Storm's coming, Captain. Looks to be a bad 1 inch." "She's out there," Elias said, the words clipped. It wasn't a question. Miller's gaze followed the captain's out the window. He knew exactly who she was. "Aye, sir. She'll have a hard go of it." For a moment, Elias was paralyzed by protocol. His duty was to the fort, to his men. Venturing out in a dust storm was a risk. Horses could spook, men could get lost, disoriented, only to be found days later, their lungs filled with sand. It was an unnecessary danger for a civilian who was not technically their responsibility. But the image of her, alone and pregnant, caught in the maelstrom, was a spur to his conscience. Duty to the uniform was one thing. Duty to a fellow human being was another older law. "Saddle my horse," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And two others. You and Corporal Jensen." Miller hesitated, a rare event. "Sir, with respect, the storm will be on us in minutes." "It's not. Now, Sergeant." Elias cut him off, his tone flat and final. He was already strapping on his gun belt and pulling his hat down low. This was not a calculated military decision. This was an instinct, a gut-deep certainty that he could not sit safely behind his walls while she faced the storm alone. His growing concern had just found its catalyst. They rode out of the gate just as the first gust of wind hit, a physical blow that carried a wall of sand with it. The world dissolved into a churning, roaring vortex of brown. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The sun was gone, blotted out. The air was thick, gritty, making each breath a conscious effort. Elias pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth. His eyes slitted against the stinging grit. He followed the faint track she left, praying the wind wouldn't obliterate them completely. It was a nightmare ride. The horses whinnied, tossing their heads in terror. Jensen, a young private, stayed close, his face a mask of nervous concentration. Sergeant Miller, ever the stoic, rode with his head down, trusting his horse and his captain. Elias pushed on, his focus narrowed to a single point, finding her. He wasn't just a captain executing a mission. He was a man answering a call only he could hear. After what felt like an eternity, Miller pointed. "There, sir." Through the swirling dust, a shape loomed. It was a hut, a pathetic-looking structure of crumbling adobe and scavenged timber, barely more than a lean-to against a rocky outcrop. It was a miracle it was still standing. They dismounted, their boots sinking into the newly formed dunes. The wind howled around the small structure, threatening to tear it apart. Elias approached the door, a crude plank of wood on leather hinges. He knocked, but his knuckles were swallowed by the roar of the storm. He pushed the door open. The interior was dark and cramped. A single shaft of dusty light from a small opening in the roof illuminated the space. And there she was. She was huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around her swollen belly, her eyes wide with a fear that was primal and absolute. She wasn't just afraid of the storm. She was terrified of them, of these armed men who had invaded her sanctuary. Her silence, which at the fort had seemed stoic, here felt like a shield of pure terror. Elias held up a hand, a gesture of peace. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from the dust. "We meant no intrusion. We were worried about the storm." She shrank back further, a small, wounded sound escaping her lips. He saw then the true depth of her isolation, the profound vulnerability of her existence. He had his men bring in the extra rations they'd packed, a side of bacon, a sack of coffee, things far beyond her usual trade. They set them gently on the dirt floor. "This is for you," Elias said softly. "To see you through." She didn't look at the food. Her eyes were locked on him, swimming with a mixture of fear and confusion. He felt like a clumsy giant in her tiny, fragile world. He wanted to offer more, to ask the questions that burned in his mind. "Who are you? Why are you here? How can I help you?" But he could see that his presence was an agony for her. The wall of her silence was built of bricks he couldn't even guess at. "We'll leave you be," he said, backing slowly toward the door. "Be safe." He pulled the door shut, leaving her to her solitude. As they mounted their horses to face the journey back, the weight of his decision settled on him. He had found her, she was safe from the storm, but he had only glimpsed the true nature of her prison. It wasn't just the desert or the hut. It was a fortress of silence and fear, and he had no idea how to breach its walls. The dust storm marked a turning point, a shift in the silent contract between the fort and the waterwoman. For Elias, it was no longer a simple matter of trade. He had seen her home, a hovel that would barely suffice for a goat. He had seen the terror in her eyes. The abstract worry had become a concrete, personal responsibility. He couldn't force his help on her, but he could ease her burden in the small ways his position allowed. He spoke to the quartermaster, a grizzled veteran named Hobbs. "When the water woman comes," Elias instructed, his tone casual but firm, "see that her rations are heavier. Add some canned peaches, some dried apples. Whatever we can spare." Hobbs, a man who could account for every last hardtack biscuit, raised an eyebrow. "That's generous, Captain. Outside the agreed-upon trade. Consider it a bonus for reliable service," Elias replied, cutting off any further questions. "And Hobbs, make sure the meat she gets is the best cut." The woman, for her part, seemed to notice the change. When she collected her rations, her eyes would sometimes dart to the extra items, a flicker of confusion in their depths. She never acknowledged it, never offered a word of thanks, but Elias thought he saw the rigid set of her shoulders relax. Just a fraction. It was a start. He began to watch for these infinitesimal signs, learning to read her silence like a language. A slight hesitation before she turned to leave meant she was more tired than usual. The speed of her walk told him how much strength she had that day. His patrols began to take on a new, undeclared purpose, citing the need to scout the eastern approaches for signs of raiders, a legitimate, if slightly exaggerated concern. He often found himself riding a wide circle that brought him within sight of her dilapidated hut. He never approached closely, respecting the boundary of fear he'd sensed in her. He would rein in his horse on a high ridge and watch through his spyglass. One late afternoon, the air cooling as the sun bled into the horizon, he saw her outside the hut. She was on her knees, tending a small, pathetic patch of dirt next to her door. She was trying to coax life from the unforgiving soil, a few straggling bean plants, and what looked like a squash vine fighting for survival. As he watched, she straightened up, arching her back with a soft groan he could imagine. She placed a hand on her belly and began to sing. It wasn't a song with words he could make out, just a low, humming melody. It was a lullaby, soft and heartbreakingly sad, sung to the desert, to the setting sun, and to the child she carried. In that moment, she ceased to be a problem to be solved or a responsibility to be managed. She became a person, a mother fighting with every fiber of her being to carve out a space for her child in a world that had given her nothing. The sight pierced the armor of his military bearing. This wasn't lunacy. It was a ferocious, desperate hope. The loneliness he felt within the fort walls paled in comparison to the stark solitude of her existence. A few days later, a patrol returned with unsettling news. Sergeant Miller reported it directly to Elias in his office. "Captain, we cut some tracks about a mile from the woman's spring. 2 men shot horses. Not military, not natives either. Looked like prospectors or drifters." A cold knot formed in Elias's stomach. The desert was full of hard men, men who wouldn't think twice about taking what they wanted from a lone woman. The spring she used, her source of livelihood, was now a point of extreme vulnerability. The threat was no longer just the environment. It had a human face. His protective instinct, which had been a low hum, now roared to life. He felt a surge of anger so intense it surprised him. Anger at the men whose tracks violated her small territory. Anger at the husband or family who had abandoned her. Anger at his own helplessness. The next morning, he watched her approach the fort, his jaw tight. She seemed to move even more slowly than usual. As she neared the gate, her foot caught on a loose stone. The yoke twisted on her shoulders, and with a cry of alarm, one of the water buckets crashed to the ground, its precious contents vanishing instantly into the thirsty dust. The soldiers at the gate froze. Before anyone could move, before Corporal Riggs could make a single snide remark, Elias was down from the watchtower and through the gate. He moved with a speed that startled his own men. He reached her side as she stared at the dark, wet patch on the ground, her face a mask of utter despair. "It's all right," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She flinched, not looking at him, her body trembling. He reached out, not to touch her, but to steady the remaining bucket. It's just water. We have more. He helped her unhitch the yoke, his hands brushing hers for a brief, electric moment. Her skin was rough, chapped but warm. He lifted the heavy wooden frame from her shoulders himself. Then he took the empty bucket and walked to the fort's water barrel. Ignoring the stares of the entire garrison, he filled it to the brim with their own brackish, rationed water and carried it back to her. He set it down beside the full one. For the first time since he had known of her existence, she lifted her head and looked directly at him. Her eyes, he saw, were the color of faded denim, and they were filled with a profound, soul-deep weariness. But in their depths, for just a second, the fear was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded flicker of something else. Gratitude, understanding, a shared moment of humanity in the dust. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He nodded back. He helped her settle the yoke back onto her shoulders, the weight of it making him marvel again at her strength. As he watched her turn and begin her slow walk home, he knew that the unspoken rules had changed forever. He couldn't just ease her burden from a distance anymore. He couldn't stand by while unknown threats circled her tiny, fragile world. He had to know her name. He had to breach the fortress of her silence. Leaving her to the mercy of the desert was no longer an option. It was a dereliction of a duty that felt older and more profound than any commission he held. The decision settled in him, hard and irrevocable. He could no longer be a passive observer to her slow-motion tragedy. Protocol and the judgment of his men be damned. He rode to the small trading post at Settlers Pass, a 2-day journey he justified as a long-range patrol. There, among the sacks of flour and barrels of nails, he found what he was looking for, a bolt of soft, blue-dyed flannel, the kind a woman might use to make swaddling clothes or a shirt for a newborn. It felt foolishly domestic in his rough, calloused hands, but it was the only way he could think of to communicate his intentions, a peace offering that spoke a language other than rations and military authority. He returned to the fort and waited for the next afternoon to cool. He rode out alone, the bolt of cloth tied behind his saddle. He didn't wear his captain's coat, just a simple shirt, his gun belt hanging loosely on his hips. He wanted to approach her not as a commander, but as a man. When he reached the small, crumbling hut, he dismounted, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar anxiety. He tied his horse loosely, giving it room to graze on the sparse vegetation. He walked to the crew door and stopped. He could hear a faint rustling inside, but no other sound. He didn't knock. Instead, he gently placed the wrapped bolt of flannel on the ground before the door. He cleared his throat, feeling a fool for talking to a closed door. "Ma'am," he began, his voice sounding loud in the immense silence of the desert. I don't mean to alarm you. I won't come in," he paused, searching for the right words. "It's not safe for you out here. I heard about men. Strangers. Near your spring." He let that sink in. "And the baby is coming soon. You can't be alone when that time comes." He took a breath. "There's a room at the fort. It's clean. It's safe. The post surgeon can help you. Please, let us help you." There was no response from within. The silence was absolute, a wall he couldn't seem to penetrate. Defeated, he stepped back. "The cloth. It's for the baby," he said softly. He turned and walked back to his horse, mounted, and rode away, feeling the weight of her silence like a physical presence at his back. His sense of urgency was sharpened the next day by Dr. Adams, the fort's surgeon. Elias had sought him out on the pretense of inspecting the infirmary. Adams was a practical, no-nonsense man who had seen more than his share of hardship. "Captain," Elias began, trying to sound detached. "Hypothetically, a woman in her final weeks of pregnancy, living in primitive conditions, performing hard physical labor daily in this heat. What are her chances?" Dr. Adams stopped cleaning his instruments and looked at Elias over the top of his spectacles. He knew exactly who the captain was talking about. "Hypothetically, Captain, her chances are poor. The child's are poorer. In her condition, with that level of exertion and malnourishment, the labor itself could kill her. She could hemorrhage. The baby could be too weak. It is a recipe for disaster." He wiped a scalpel with a clean cloth. "She needs rest, proper food, and a clean bed. And she needs them now. The doctor's words were a death sentence. The vague, future worry was now a ticking clock, a high-pressure countdown to a tragedy he felt compelled to prevent. His mind raced. He could order her brought to the fort, but forcing her would only deepen her terror. He had to convince her. His resolve hardened. He walked out onto the parade ground where a group of soldiers, including Corporal Riggs, were repairing a wagon wheel. He stopped before them, his shadow falling over their work. "Listen to me, all of you," he said, his voice ringing with authority. The men stopped their work, surprised by his tone. "The water woman is to be considered under my personal protection. If she decides to come into this fort, she will be given quarters and treated with the utmost respect. Any man who offers her anything less, a disrespectful word, a sideways glance, will answer directly to me. Your duties will be the least of your worries." He locked eyes with Riggs, whose smug expression had vanished, replaced by one of sullen understanding. "Am I clear?" A chorus of "Yes, sir," answered him. The message was delivered. He had laid the groundwork. Now, he just needed her to accept. But the next morning, the sun climbed high into the sky, and the horizon remained empty. The usual time for her arrival came and went. An hour passed, then two. The men grew restless, casting anxious glances to the east. The routine of the fort felt broken, incomplete. A knot of cold dread tightened in Elias's chest. The doctor's words echoed in his mind. A recipe for disaster. He could wait no longer. He strode to the stables, ignoring Sergeant Miller's questioning look. He saddled his own horse, his movements swift and efficient, driven by a fear more potent than any he had faced in battle. He didn't take a patrol. He didn't take an escort. He rode out alone, the frantic pounding of his horse's hooves a match for the frantic pounding of his own heart. He spurred the animal on, his mind filled with terrible images, the men from the tracks, a fall, or worse. The labor beginning, alone in that desolate hut. He rode toward her silence, praying it hadn't become permanent. The ride was a frantic, desperate prayer. The sun beat down, but Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The silence of the desert, usually a comfort, was now a taunt. Every rock formation looked like a body. Every shadow held a potential horror. When her hovel finally came into view, his heart leaped into his throat. The door, the crude plank of wood he had spoken to the day before, was slightly ajar, swinging listlessly in the faint breeze. A terrible, profound stillness hung over the place. He swung down from his horse before it had even fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice hoarse. Silence. He drew his pistol, his training taking over, though he knew deep down the threat here wasn't something a bullet could stop. He pushed the door fully open and stepped into the dim, close air of the hut. And then he saw her. She was on a pallet of old blankets in the corner, her body contorted. A low, guttural moan escaped her lips, a sound of pure, animal agony. Her face, beaded with sweat, was pale and drawn. Her eyes were wide with terror and pain. She was in labor, alone. All his military training, all his experience in command and control, evaporated in an instant. He was just a man, utterly out of his depth, facing the raw, brutal, elemental force of creation. He holstered his pistol. It was useless here. For a moment, he was frozen by a sense of profound inadequacy. Then, another wave of pain washed over her, and she cried out, a sharp, desperate sound that broke his paralysis. He knelt beside her, his mind racing. Water. The doctor's words. Clean bed. Rest. He looked around the squalid hut. There was nothing clean. He grabbed one of the buckets she used for carrying water. It was half full, and found a relatively clean rag. He dipped it in the cool water and gently wiped the sweat from her forehead. She flinched at his touch, her eyes wild. "It's all right," he said, his voice a low, calming murmur. "I'm here. You're not alone." He kept repeating it, a mantra against the tide of her pain and his own fear. "You're not alone." He was clumsy, awkward. He was a man who knew how to load a cannon and dress a bullet wound, not how to coax a new life into the world. But he was all she had. He propped her up as best he could, using his own coat as a pillow for her head. He held her hand, her fingers gripping his with astonishing strength as each contraction seized her. In her agony, her fear of him seemed to dissolve, replaced by a desperate need for a human anchor in the storm of pain. He became that anchor. He spoke to her, not about anything important, just low, meaningless reassurances, the tone more important than the words. Hours passed. The sliver of light from the roof crawled across the dirt floor. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the dim hut, the rhythmic, agonizing struggle, and his voice, a steady bass note in the symphony of her pain. He saw her strength, a force of nature that humbled him. The same resilience that had carried her across the desert day after day was now focused on this one monumental task. Then, the nature of her cries changed. There was a new urgency, a new intensity. And in a final, convulsive effort, with a cry that seemed to tear from the very depths of her soul, the baby was born. A silence fell, thick and sudden, broken only by their ragged breathing. And then a small, choked gasp, followed by a thin, wavering cry. A life, a new life in the midst of all this desolation. It was a girl, small, red, and impossibly fragile. Elias, his hands shaking, found a piece of cloth, the soft, blue flannel he had left at her door, and carefully wrapped the crying infant, his movements clumsy but infinitely gentle. He cleaned the baby as best he could and placed her in her mother's arms. She lay back, utterly spent, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. She looked at the small bundle in her arms, and a look of such profound, exhausted love washed over her face that it took Elias's breath away. His uniform was stained, his stoic demeanor shattered. He had witnessed something sacred, a messy, painful, terrifying miracle, and he was irrevocably changed by it. The emotional distance he had cultivated for years was gone, sacrificed in the crucible of that tiny hut. He gave her a few minutes, a quiet eternity where the only sounds were the baby's soft cries and the mother's weary breathing. Then, he knelt beside her again. The question that had haunted him for months finally found its voice, no longer a matter of curiosity, but of vital importance. "What is your name?" he asked softly. She turned her head, her gaze meeting his. The fear was gone. The exhaustion was there, but so was a new clarity, a new light. Her lips parted, and she spoke, her voice a dry whisper, the first word he had ever heard her speak to him. Alara. He repeated it, the name feeling solid and real on his tongue. Alara. He looked at her, at the fierce, protective way she held her daughter, and he made a decision that was as certain as the sunrise. "You're not staying here," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I'm taking you and your daughter home." He didn't mean the fort. He meant something more. He meant safety. He meant a beginning. It was a promise, sealed not with a signature, but with the shared miracle of a child's first cry. He worked with a tenderness he didn't know he possessed. He helped Alara drink some water. Then, after giving her time to regain a sliver of strength, he helped her to her feet. She was weak, leaning heavily on him, but her eyes never left the precious bundle in her arms. He led her outside into the late afternoon light, which now seemed soft and forgiving. With immense care, he lifted her onto his horse, settling her sideways on the saddle. Then, he took the baby from her, the tiny, warm weight of the flannel-wrapped child a startling, profound anchor in his arms. He mounted behind Alara, holding the baby securely against his chest, his other arm steadying Alara herself. The ride back was slow, a funereal procession transformed into a strange, holy caravan. His horse, sensing the fragility of its cargo, walked with a steady, careful gait. The sight that greeted the fort was one that would be etched into its legend. The sentries on the wall stared, their mouths agape. As he rode through the main gate, the usual hustle and bustle of the fort ground to a halt. Soldiers stopped their work, their conversations dying in their throats. They saw their captain, the grim, unmovable Elias Thorne, his face streaked with dust and something that looked like tears, his uniform stained. Before him sat the waterwoman, weak but resolute, and in the captain's arms, nestled against his chest, was a newborn baby. Corporal Riggs was among the men in the yard. He saw the scene, saw the look on his captain's face, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a hot flush of shame. He looked down at his boots, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The quiet judgment of the barracks had been silenced by the undeniable truth of what had transpired. Dr. Adams was there in an instant, his professional demeanor masking his astonishment. "Get her to the infirmary," he ordered, and 2 soldiers rushed to help Elias dismount. The post-surgeon took the baby, his practiced hands infinitely more suited to the task, and for a moment Elias felt a strange sense of loss. As Alara was helped towards the infirmary, a few of the soldiers' wives, women who had kept their distance and shared in the whispered speculation, came forward. One brought a clean blanket, another cup of broth. The sight of the child, of a mother's fierce trial and a commander's unexpected compassion, had broken through the hard shell of frontier suspicion. Humanity had won. Alara was no longer the silent, nameless specter from the desert. She had a name. She had a daughter. She had a room in the infirmary, and she had the unwavering, declared protection of the fort's commander. She was still weak, still a woman who had been pushed to the very brink, but she was no longer a victim adrift in the wilderness. Her agency had been forged in pain and delivered into safety. A few days later, Elias stood outside her door in the infirmary. He hesitated, then knocked softly. A quiet, "Come in," answered him. He entered the small, clean room. Alara was sitting up in a simple chair near the window, rocking her daughter, who was asleep in a makeshift cradle. The light from the window touched her hair, and she looked peaceful. The deep lines of exhaustion and fear were beginning to recede from her face. "Captain," she said, her voice still quiet, but steady now. "Elias," he corrected her gently. "My name is Elias." She looked up at him, a small, shy smile touching her lips. "Elias," she repeated. "Thank you. For everything." "There's no need for thanks," he said, feeling awkward. He held out a small object he'd been whittling for the past 2 nights. It was a crude but recognizable carving of a bird. "For the little one." She took it, her fingers brushing his. "It's beautiful." They fell into a comfortable silence, the only sounds the soft creak of the cradle and the distant calls from the parade ground. The stark, intimidating fort had somehow become a sanctuary. The quiet of the room was a balm against the memory of the howling wind and the endless, aching horizon. Later, Elias stood at the window of his office, the window from which he had watched her torturous daily journey for so many weeks. He looked out at the vast, empty expanse of the desert she had crossed, the landscape that had been both her prison and her proving ground. But he found his gaze wasn't drawn to the distant horizon anymore. He turned and looked across the dusty square, towards the infirmary window where a soft lamp now glowed. He did not know what the future held for them. He did not know her story or what troubles might lie in her past. He only knew that her name was Alara, and that she had a daughter who held a small wooden bird in her cradle. In knowing her name, he had done more than just rescue a woman from the desert. He had found a new purpose, a new frontier, not of land, but of the heart. And for the first time in a long, long time, the great, empty West did not feel quite so lonely. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.